Thank you enormously to our panelists for a distressing trio of talks. I'm sure there are questions, and I know that our intrepid helpers will be out with the mics. But before we opened it up to you, I wondered if we could have a bit of crosstalk across the panel right now. I think that would be very useful. I'm sure we have questions for each other. I'd like to put out to all three of you a question about actors, which is to say, where does the power lie in some of these decisions? So, for example, Sophie, you explained, I think, some of the turn in Quebec policies as a result of a government change. I'm wondering, Gordon and Aisling, if you would see this more as the political power of actors in the market. Like, where do we find these? Where's the engine here? And if we wanted to get at it, where do we look for it? Maybe this way.
Well, is this on? Yeah. Politics has a lot to do with it. Sophie, you said things began to fall apart in 2003. When did Jean Charest become the premier of Quebec? Okay, around 2003. So, and we've had that. It was the Parti Québécois before that built the system, and then we had conservative governments of different stripes, mostly Parti Québécois for a little while since then, and so they've been pressed to offer better childcare by some actors amongst the advocates in Quebec, but their responses have been pretty negative. Anyway, that's a big discussion. But so politics has a big thing to do with it. But I mean, my look at the different countries, and even Norway, it sort of says, well, bad things can happen if you're not looking, and there are for-profit actors that are out there willing to take an advantage of careless governments that provide an opportunity. So in Norway, what they did charmingly was to say, it's fair if we provide the same amount of financial support to a municipal center and to any new private center that sets up. Well, that didn't account for the fact that the private centers had they had lower quality, the regulations, they were able to manipulate them, they ended up having lower costs of provision, and so they were able to use this charming, we've got to be fair and equitable in between the municipal centers and the other centers to manipulate the system, right? And so if you're careless about your regulations and your controls, bad things can happen even if the government is reasonably positive. So more negative news. I apologize.
I'm curious to see Sophie and then Aisling.
Okay, so it's working? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so yes, the Liberals, like Jean Charest, but we also have a very strong feminist movement in Quebec, and one group that has been particularly vocal is Ma Place au Travail, My Place at Work, if I translate. This is a group of women, it started during the pandemic, who have been pressuring the government to create spaces, because these are women that are not able to get back to work after their maternity benefit because they don't have a childcare space. So that group has been really pressuring the Ministère de la Famille, and it's almost like getting personal, like they don't like each other. And one thing that has been happening, and that I personally find a little concerning, is that group has been pushing for alternatives to childcare. Mm-hmm. So if you don't provide me with a childcare space, can you provide me with allowance so I can take care of my child at home? Or can you provide me with some kind of extended maternity benefit? So far, nothing has changed, but I think it's concerning to hear those voices. And this group has self-identify as being a strong feminist group, and I believe they are. But the alternatives that they are pressuring for is not very interesting.
Okay, Anne?
Thank you, Susan. It's really tricky. I was trying to frantically think all the equations through my head. I think absolutely the for-profit sector, as it gets larger, has the balance of power tips. And so I can see from even my examples in New Zealand, the government gets put over a barrel regularly when it tries to bring in something that looks a little bit more unfavourable to the for-profit sector in terms of allowing them business as usual. And then they say, well, actually, no, you know what, I'm not going to, we won't take part in that scheme. And then the government's left with this universal scheme, which more than half the sector won't operationalise. So, and that's a more recent sort of balance of power tip. But even back when this started in the 1980s in New Zealand, the opportunity was there to close that off. Really, that balance of power has changed over time. I also think a lot of the problem is the political cycle, is a 3-year turnaround. And, you know, New Zealand, certainly, I suspect other countries too, have had childcare front and centre on their political campaign, pre-election campaigns for the last couple of cycles. And there's such pressure on governments now to try and meet the growing need that they're sort of trying to work and patch up the system that they currently have rather than give themselves a chance to make a major overhaul. And so there's all sorts of, I think, tensions coming from parents, coming from providers themselves, which makes it a really challenging space to try and, but I think there's such a wonderful opportunity here because the money is there, the will is there, it would seem. Whereas we're trying to retrospectively fix the policy making that happens in New Zealand is constantly trying to fix the mistake from the previous policy that ran away on them. And so we're in that wheel, we're turning in that wheel at the time, all the time.
All right. Well, thank you to all three of you. In my own research, I've spent a lot of time trying to think about the role of a for-profit lobby which wants to influence policy and change the regulatory environment in which it operates in order to enhance its own profitability. And I do think there are times in which sort of the idea of an open table, of the whole sector at the table, helping to speak to the table, kind of lets the fox into the hen house or whatever the right word. Anyway, I'm sure there are many questions in our audience. We have at least 2 mics, and we have time for lots of questions before the break and then our final panel. Sharon, looks like you have the first question.
Thanks very much. To add on to something Gordon said and then my question. So, Gordon, your first point was that there is this myth that the for-profit sector can expand more quickly and more nimbly. And in BC, that was our friendly government's mistake to think that they could depend on the for-profit sector, which my colleague Lynelle Anderson constantly points out to our government that yes, you think that they use their own money perhaps, or they're quicker to expand, but then it's the public paying for the operations for them to pay off their mortgages, which then the public's paying for their private asset. But I think one of I'm curious to know what you think, because I think we have a great political vision in some provinces and federally, but I am concerned that it's the bureaucrats who are tasked with delivering on the vision. And if the bureaucrats don't know or understand childcare, which is what we're seeing in BC, that things go this terrible way which is being described for us. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts about that disconnect between political vision and the capacity of bureaucrats to deliver.
So you're asking if it's a public administration, a public management problem. Panelists.
Yeah, okay, I'll take first crack at it. Just on the first part, like, I'm an economist. I teach theory of, and in terms of the expansion and the ability of for-profits to expand, in your sort of typical market situation, there's huge risk. And somebody comes in and takes their own money or borrowed money, and they take the risk that they will have made a wrong decision, that the demand won't be there, that they'll lose their shirt, so to speak, right? And so it seems reasonable to sort of say, okay, well, if you're willing to risk the money, that's, you're putting yourself forward and we should go with you. Well, this is a market in which there isn't really any risk. Okay, we're talking about government providing 90% of the revenues going forward in a guaranteed market in which there will be huge shortages for many years because the demand vastly exceeds the supply. So the model that you should go with the private sector because they're the ones that are willing to take the risk, it just doesn't apply at all, right? And so we do need to come up with ideas for how do you build the public or not-for-profit sectors. And, we do have a sense of what it would mean if the public sector takes it over, municipal childcare, Ontario or school boards. But frankly, most of the expansion in Canada over the next number of years will not come from the public sector. It will come from the not-for-profit sector. So we need to pay attention to how do we facilitate the expansion in the not-for-profit sector? And that's a work in progress. Thank goodness for the federal government stepping in and saying, okay, we're going to provide $1 billion of low-interest loan money, which will be available sometime in the future for those not-for-profits to expand and build. But we don't really have the means, the methods, the institutions to support not-for-profit expansion. And so to come to your point, which is that a failure of bureaucratic imagination? Partly, like none of us, including the bureaucrats, have a good sense of what is the alternative way of expansion. We're not very good at that. And we've done it in Ontario. I mean, we got, 75 to 80% of all childcare centres are in the not-for-profit, of childcare spaces are not-for-profit, 0 to 12. So we've done a lot of not-for-profit expansion but not, rapid all at once. So we need to work out methods of doing that. The bureaucrats play some role in that, but none of us have really developed the institutions for making that happen yet. So that's a work in progress.
Mm-hmm. While Sophie and Aisling are reflecting, I'll take a stab at it, right? I mean, many of the mechanisms we have in provincial governments, at any rate, outside of Ontario, where there was a municipal role, were designed to do a particular kind of task, which was to ensure safety through licensing and then administer subsidies. There wasn't a lot of capacity for other kinds of development. Reasonably so. It wasn't a government job. And so some of the skills and knowledge and capacity aren't necessarily available in the people doing the job. And as mechanisms and levers, those tools need to be created. And so that's some of the questions, right? What is it that will be created? Thoughts on this question? Yeah? Okay.
Oh, thank you. I don't envy your working with the sort of federal system. It seems extremely challenging, and that's an understatement. My mind is whirring with the different ways in which things play out in different provinces, etc., and it seems extremely challenging. So I feel a lot of empathy for the bureaucrats and the policymakers, because at least in New Zealand we have one Ministry of Ed, which the knowledge and expertise is housed there. We don't have to proliferate it across however many provinces and other, that's extremely difficult. So I think there's a lot of capacity building probably needs to happen in that space. Maybe that's already happening, I'm not sure. One of the things I've been thinking about recently is the way in which the for-profit sector is pivoting to meet the emphasis on not-for-profit. Mm-hmm. And so what does it actually look like? We have these categories that we work with, but when we scratch the surface, they don't necessarily look the same across the board. So for example, in New Zealand, our major primary for-profit provider has recently metamorphosized as a not-for-profit, with charitable status, much to many people's surprise. And they've designed a whole new business model as a not-for-profit, which, works for them. And that's all I'm prepared to say on camera. We couldn't have even preempted. I think this is happening here. I've heard it's happening in other parts of the world. You can't, so even the categorizations of what we're using, I think, is problematic. So even as a policy maker going forward, again, we really need to get in there and understand what these business models look like, what these entities look like. We need a lot more research to figure out what we're dealing with before we can even start to make those regulatory structures and figure out what is what. So I think there's a lot of work has to happen in just the nomenclature, just designing, figuring out what it is we're dealing with. That's sort of the first thing I think needs to happen.
Thank you. I'm half a day late in realizing this, but there's when you speak and ask your questions, maybe you also want to say who you are. We haven't been doing that. Pam, do you have the mic next? Somebody at that. Oh, Leanna.
I was good.
All right. Okay.
My name is Leanna. I'm a PhD student, and I have a question for each of you. For Gordon, my question is, you mentioned the three variables that sort of shape when we see the emergence of for-profit care, when there is demand, when there is an injection of public funds, and when there are weak regulatory controls. And I was curious about, in your research, if you've come across the growth of for-profit where the regulatory controls have been variable, where they have been stronger, and what happens sort of when you move those. I think of France as an interesting case. I know it's not an Anglophone model, so there's maybe less exposure to literature, but I'm curious about the relationship between stronger regulatory controls and if that's just a place where for-profit won't emerge, if it drives it away, what you've seen. For Sophie, my question is about the emergence of investor-backed childcare in Quebec. If you could give us an insight.
So, the emergence of?
Investor-backed childcare, like of the sort Ashlyn was talking about in Quebec, if that's something you know. If not, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
And then my question for Ashlyn is about the corporate governance controls, and you mentioned the challenges with that because of the geographic dispersal and the level of complexity. But I mean, we do have corporate regulation in many complex spheres. So I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about the challenges.
Okay. Once again, three-way question. Gord?
Yeah, I don't think I have a good answer for you, really. I mean, I don't think I have a model of a country in which there's been a big move forward of for-profit childcare, and then the government sort of developed the regulatory response to then rein it all in. I mean, we might be looking at Norway, but I don't know what the balance sheet is on Norway. It's sort of too soon. And most of the others haven't had effective responses. So I mean, in a number of cases, I think, well, and New Zealand is one of them. Mm-hmm. Many of my friends and colleagues in New Zealand who have been wonderful advocates for many years seem to have given up on the childcare system in New Zealand and figured it's out of control. So that's not a very positive answer, but maybe others will come up with examples. I mean, Martha, maybe you have some thoughts on governments that have responded very positively and just Norway. Yeah, they're in Norway's in the process. They've set up an Office of Financial Accountability or something like that, which is sort of now trying to say, okay, you have to be more open about the finances. They've done that, and they've changed the regulations so that they now have staff-child ratios and qualifications that are done on a Norway-wide basis. So they're probably the best, but it's still too early to know whether they end up being successful.
Gordon, you were in Australia recently, and I think there's some conversations about stronger regulatory frameworks there, which you would be probably better placed to talk about as being there only last week, perhaps. I'm putting you on the spot, but I think there's talk about if you have more than 25 centres, you're subject to much stricter regulatory oversight and accountability oversight than a smaller chain, for example. So trying to differentiate at least in some rudimentary way the scale of what we're dealing with is some small start. But again, it's extremely difficult because even the standard reporting, is it asking the right questions to talk about where the money's going in terms of childcare? I think, there's a lot of, again, that methodological question I think is really important. Yeah, sorry to jump in.
That's good, yeah. I see a question in the audience which might bear on the Quebec answer, perhaps. Krista?
Well, it's actually a general comment.
Oh, okay.
And first I want to thank you for your very inspiring presentations and Sophie, putting Quebec in a nutshell is a real challenge. But I hear this common preoccupation of creating spaces, and that we don't want the for-profit sector taking over, and it is, unfortunately. And in Quebec, if you look at it, the for-profit spaces for children, they're more than for the Centre de la Petite Enfance, which is very, very distressing. And our politician, our dear Prime Minister, is a businessman. So obviously privatization is something that comes easy for him, which also happens in the health in the health sector. So if we look at the budget, and I looked through it, and it took me a long time to find a word about childcare. I thought it was going to be in the first part where they talk about education and healthcare, because to me it's part of that. Anyway, there was no mention of the centre, because the idea was to convert those for-profits, subsidized or not, into Centre de la Petite Enfance. Isn't happening, or very, very little. And they continue to encourage, it's cheaper, to convert the non-subsidized private daycares into subsidized private daycares. But they remain for profits. And that is really scary, and that's really upsetting, because we don't want to fund them. And so in all of that, I also, I'm really preoccupied with quality. In all of that, we talk about all these logistic or political decisions, but quality is going down the river, because we lower the bar in every way. We lower the bar, and I can talk about Quebec, where the qualifications, they just developed a new directives for qualifications that are acceptable, and they become more and more fluid and more widespread. And we always think, we have to monitor quality, or we have to get an idea about quality. And we had a number of studies in Quebec, and they showed that the for-profits are of lower quality, but the not-for-profits aren't perfect either. Let's not forget, it always depends what you compare yourself to, upward, downward social comparison. But what I personally find very interesting is what the ministry, because the ministry is part of the government, and you want to respond to parents' needs and to please parents. Yeah, we're going to create 1,000 new spaces, but parents need a space, and they can't be critical consumers because they don't have a choice. But this evaluation process that the government, the Ministry of the Family, has put in place is questionable. Questionable because, and you presented the statistics that more CPE meet their benchmarks, and the benchmarks are very low. I don't want to go into detail, but they're like medium, moyen, and basically borderline, borderline not satisfactory. So, of course, if you have higher benchmarks, probably very few for-profits would meet them. So anyway, these are my preoccupations, because I'm thinking about what the children need, and we're there for the children. The children aren't there for us. And we're not moving in the right direction. I think we all agree on that. But what we share, a common concern, is that we're not getting what we need. We're not getting the political support of putting something into place which makes sense. And, with all the good intentions. We don't have the money. We don't have qualified people. And qualifications, if we go talk about qualifications, they're different from province to province. True. And within Quebec, they're kind of lowering, and the best one is, I really got upset about that. They have now the status of temporarily qualified personnel. which means you don't even have to have finished your high school leaving, and you can take a fast track an attestation collégiale, which is a short program, and you will be able to be counted among the qualified personnel. So it's when we use those terms, qualified, it's like bubblegum, Anyway, I could go on forever, but thank you. So interesting.
Thank you for rounding that up. Merci, Krista. I think we have Linnell has the next question. I think the mic got to you.
It did. Thank you very much, Linnell Anderson from BC, and thank you for all of the panelists for this really important conversation. I really appreciate it, and it's so central to the work that we're all trying to do. And I just want to go back to, I guess, Gordon, first of all, but this is a question for all the panelists and folks across the room. When your first comment was that one of the beliefs, and Sharon brought this up too, but one of the beliefs is that, we can expand rapidly in the for-profit, we've shown that, and it's private money. Mm-hmm. And of course, I try to make the point, many of us try to make the point, it's not private money, because the money that's gone into trying to build a facility is going to be tried to be recovered in the operating funding that would be provided to the program. So there's no private money, or as you have said, shown Gordon, really any private risk involved in this endeavor. So we know that the CWELC is committed to expansion in nonprofit and public and Indigenous childcare, and I'm wondering what mechanisms exist across the country to have halted or slowed down or stopped the expansion of for-profit childcare. And you were saying, Gordon, we need some more updated data. Your data was from 2021, which is when CWELC came in. We've done some estimates in BC, and even though we no longer give capital grants to for-profit programs in BC, our estimates are showing that we're still seeing quite a growth in for-profit childcare, which is not surprising. There's no guardrails yet in place to stop that. You can still get all of the operating funding, all of the fee reduction, and so on. There's some accountability around caps and fees or increases and so on. So there's a little bit of guardrails, but not enough to apparently have stopped the expansion. So I'm wondering if you're aware of any other examples in other provinces where there have been stronger guardrails that are halting the growth of for-profit childcare, which is a fundamental goal of CWELC.
Well, you do know that you're speaking in a province that has restricted public funding only to not-for-profit programs. And earlier on the day, today, we've seen questions in the chat that ask us, is it fair, for example, that staff working in a for-profit childcare do not get to participate in a pension plan? I mean, these are real questions to wrestle with, but for the moment, Manitoba has restricted funding. It's certainly available to jurisdictions to make these policy choices. Saskatchewan's done the same. At least one of the territories does the same. This is one mechanism. Actual public policy. Other thoughts about?
I think I have the solution. It's very easy, but it's very complicated. You stop.
No.
You put the moratorium.
No.
That's what we did. There was a hard stop. No more money. We're not giving. What the PQ did is 1997. They gave the for-profit childcare centers 3 options with a knife under the throat. You become a CPE. You offer subsidized childcare spaces, or we're not going to help you. So figure it out. And so many, and they were not allowed to develop new spaces. So you have to have very strong political will. Mm-hmm. At some point, I can't remember in which election, but recent elections, the PQ was strongly advocating that if they lost, but they were saying that if we win, it's CPEs only. It's finished. It's nonprofit, and that's the model that we want, and we want to commit to offering childcare spaces exclusively in the nonprofit, but they didn't win. So, but it's easy to say, it's really hard to do. But it seems, at least in Quebec, when you have a very strong politician who's really determined, then it works, but it's hard.
Could I briefly?
Yes.
Could I just jump in briefly? I've been thinking about this quite a bit, and I think putting in a mixed market where there is a for-profit element, putting in this massive edifice of regulatory restrictions, it just creates an enormous administrative burden for governments to manage. And from my experience, there's a change in political government, and it's the first thing that gets sacrificed on the red tape altar are the regulatory guardrails that seem to be put in place for very good reason. You know, we know why they were there, but they're the first things to go. So I started to think more about, well, why are they interested in this sector? Because it's secure funding, it's easy money, and actually in terms of profit making, the majority of it comes from pushing down on costs of wages. So if you take some of the main costs out of the equation, if you pay staff as teachers at a rate that's equitable and in par with other parts of the education sector, then you remove a huge amount of that money from the as malleable money that's in the for-profit sector. This might be really painting a very too evident a picture of it, but you remove the incentives. You remove those financial incentives. You streamline. You take them on as publicly funded parts of the sector, and then the thing evens out. I suspect. You know, if the level of for-profit isn't there, then I suspect you won't get the heightened incentive for the kinds of entities, at least, that I've been talking about today, and probably not the big box services, maybe, I'm not so sure. But it removes a lot of the wriggle room, and it deprioritizes this huge regulatory edifice that I think would become a nightmare, and I think doesn't last the test of time anyway, unfortunately, from my negative experience of it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, folks, we've just hit 2:40, and we have a new panel starting in 5 minutes. So this is a chance to get up, do what you need to do, have a few minutes, allow us to do a shift change. Please join me in thanking this very good panel.